Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name is Joshua, and this is episode 88. Let's give this Buddhism thing another try. This episode, we are going to return to the story of Buddhism in the archipelago, specifically what was going on into the next reign. And what a fortuitous episode to do it on as well. For those who aren't aware, 8 is an auspicious number in Buddhism, so I figure for episode 88, this makes for a decent topic. Now, back in episode 86, we saw the death of Ame Kunioshi, aka Kimmei Tennou, in 576 CE, just as a delegation of envoys arrived from Goguryeo. As we noted at the time, Nunakura Futodamashiki no Mikoto, aka Bidatsu Tennou, succeeded Ame Kunioshi to the throne. You may recall that Nunakura was the second son of Ame Kunioshi and his queen, Ishihime. His older brother, Yata no Tamakatsu no Ohoye, appears to have been the crown prince, but then he passed away, and so Nunakura was raised up in his stead. In many ways, Nunakura represents the old guard at this time. The Chronicles make it pretty clear that he is a classical heir, descended through multiple royal lineages. His father, Ame Kunioshi, was of course the latest in the lineage descending from Ohoye no Okimi, that is, Kimmei Tennou, while his mother, Ishihime, was the daughter of Takeo Hiro Kuniyoshi Tate, aka Senka Tennou, which is to say Ame Kuniyoshi's brother by another mother, quite literally. In fact, one wonders if the reason that Magari no Ohine and Takeo, aka Ankan and Senka Tennou, were even mentioned as sovereigns in the Chronicles was because of the way that they therefore legitimized Nunakura's own reign, as some scholars have suggested that they really might not have ruled at all, and that really it was all Ame Kunioshi during the entire period that their reigns covered. After all, most of the sovereigns up to this point have been descended through multiple royal lineages. And it was even depicted in the Chronicles as though Magari no Ohine and Takeo's reigns were simply regencies, holding the seat for their younger and more legitimate brother. Nunakura held fast to the old traditions in another way as well. We are pointedly told in the Nihon Shoki that though he was of good character, he was not a Buddhist. This is perhaps a curious statement to make. After all, none of the previous sovereigns have really been Buddhist either. But then this is the first sovereign to take the throne since the archipelago had been exposed to Buddhist teachings, at least according to the narrative. From our perspective today, that doesn't really seem all that strange. Buddhism had just come to the archipelago, and honestly, it hadn't made that much of a splash from what we can tell. Back in episode 85, Sogono Iname had set up a temple and started worshipping an image that had come from the continent, but that initial attempt was sabotaged by others, including Mononobe no Okoshi. The old families were, of course, rather invested in the system of rituals around the local kami and the socio-political power that they derived from being in charge of those same rituals. Sogono Iname had passed away towards the end of the previous reign, and his son, Umako, took up the mantle as head of the Soga family, and also his father's position as Oomi. Meanwhile, Mononobe no Okoshi had also passed away, and it seems that at the head of the Mononobe family was his son, a man by the name of Yuge no Moriya, who was confirmed in his position as Omuraji by the new sovereign. Or at least that's what the Nihon Shoki tells us, and it may be because of his prominence in the story to come. The Sendai Kuji Hongi claims it was Moriya's brother, Oichi no Mikari, who was made Omuraji, but there's really little else on him. Regardless of whether it was Moriya or Mikari, the power dynamics between the Soga and Mononobe families were still in a similar situation compared to the previous reign, just now in new hands. So for all that the Chronicles stress how much Nunakura was not a Buddhist, neither was he particularly nativist. He enjoyed the classics that were being imported from the mainland, and presumably was able to read in the continental fashion. He was also interested in ensuring good relations with the Korean peninsula, with both Yamato's traditional ally of Baekje, but also with the growing kingdom of Shilla. Still, Buddhism was apparently off the table for him. For the most part, his reign started similar to any other. After coming to the throne in 572, he confirmed his wife as queen and his mother being hailed as the Queen Dowager. He also set up his own palace site at Ohoye in Kudara, in the land of Kawachi. Interestingly, this appears to place him outside of the Nara Basin, certainly outside of the lands of the Soga. However, the area that he settled in, Kudara, is also interesting, because that name, Kudara, is a reading given to the characters for Baekje. In fact, the kanji or Sinitic characters they use are the same as Baekje, and if you didn't know otherwise, you would likely read them as probably something like Byakuzai. However, just as many characters for the Han and Tang dynasties are read as Kara, likely referencing the fact that things came to the archipelago through the early Kara states, the name for Baekje was rendered as Kudara. And to be honest, I've never seen a good reason why the characters came to be read this way, or even whether or not that was the reading from the Chronicles when they were compiled. I mean, if anyone out there knows, I'd appreciate it and shoot me an email or hit me up on Twitter. Certainly, it was the authoritative reading later on, and there are plenty of place names that use that reading as Kudara. Still, I'm not absolutely certain when that reading became common, but that is how these kanji are often pronounced today for whatever reason. Now, just because Nunakura wasn't a Buddhist didn't mean that Buddhism wasn't still making inroads into the islands. And while the Soga family would stand at the forefront of Buddhist proselytization, our first actor is actually a little different and largely forgotten from what I can tell. His name was Owake no Miko, or the Royal Prince Owake. This name, unfortunately, doesn't do a lot to help us identify him. I mean, he's a royal prince, meaning he had a direct claim to the royal lineage, born to one of the sovereigns or their progeny. O means big or elder, and Wake, well, that's a bit more complicated. Based on the way it is used in older names, it would appear to be a title or honorific of some kind. Traditional Japanese etymology claims that it comes from the fact that wake comes from wakeru, to break, to cut off, or separate. So basically, they come from a line that has been cut off from the royal lineage, but they still have royal blood. This seems a little suspect to me, personally. I do sometimes wonder if it could be related to the term waka, which also shows up in a lot in names, but that's also a stretch. Instead, I think it might just be an old title or kabane for a person of not insignificant rank that later just wasn't used anymore. Still, it isn't clear what is meant, and even then, this is a pretty generic name that doesn't tell us much about who this guy actually was. One theory is that this is another name for someone mentioned elsewhere in the Chronicles, perhaps even one of the later sovereigns. People at the time that the Chronicles were written knew who it referred to, but it's much harder to piece together today. Another suggestion is that this Owake was someone who was otherwise written out of the history for whatever reason. Of course, why they were written out, one could only fathom a guess, and why this was still included, who knows. Finally, there is the thought that the name could be misspelled. Back in the time of hand copying, over thousands of copies, it would be easy to slip up once or twice in the thousands of characters they had written already. Later scribes then faithfully copied the mistake, and suddenly, a new name is born. Even then, though, I'm not sure we could make a good guess as to who this really was. What we do know is that in 577, this royal prince, known only as Owake in the Chronicles, went to Baekje, presumably as an ambassador for Yamato, and he returned with religious books and 6 individuals, including monks, a nun, an architect, and a Buddhist image maker. It's significant that what this royal prince brought back was more than just books this time. Now there were artisans being imported who could actually make Buddhist statues and temples here in the islands. They would have known how those temples were built, the significance of the layout, how the wooden beams were carved, and even how the distinctive roof tiles were made. And this wasn't just different craft techniques. There were rules for how a temple was supposed to be constructed, the different buildings, even the relics to be buried underneath a building to help make it sacred. Likewise, the images also followed particular rules. Whether it was the image of the Buddha or one of the many accompanying deities, it wasn't enough to be a stone carver or a woodworker. Buddhist imagery was its whole own thing. All of this was very different from other art forms and architecture in the archipelago at the time. It's also telling that Ohoye brought back monks and a nun. Specifically, they had brought back monks who specialized in various practices, including meditation and mantra recitation. You may recall that earlier the people of the archipelago had received images and texts, and it seems that Sogono Iname was trying to piece together what to do based on what he could read, likely interpreting all of it through the eyes of the local religious practices of the time. An ordained monk and an ordained nun, however, would have known the proper rituals and how they were to be conducted. But almost more importantly, you needed Buddhist monks and nuns to make other Buddhist monks and nuns. Although, technically, you typically need more than that. You should have a Sangha, a Buddhist community. While traditions vary, it would seem you need at least 4 monks to make a Sangha, and some traditions require at least 10. And I presume the same or more for women. Whether or not they could authoritatively conduct all the rites, though, the monks and the nun could, one assumes, at least teach how they were supposed to be done. These newcomers appear to have been ensconced at a place called Ohoye-ji, or Ohoye Temple, in Naniwa. Some suggest that this may be in error, and once again, that Ohoye was actually a typo for Ogori, an official residence for envoys traveling to and from Japan. If this latter case is true, then much like Sogono Iname had turned his house into a temple, these Buddhist teachers may have been staying at the Ogoriji, and there was a scribal error of wake for gori. This theory, though, also notes that the word ji or tera in the kunyomi reading, well, it originally meant an official government building. But that meaning gradually shifted to referring to Buddhist temples as Buddhism made its way across the desert through the Yellow River and Yangtze River valleys. By the time it made it to the Korean peninsula and across the strait to the Japanese archipelago, Buddhist temples were all using the suffix ji, as far as we can tell. The problem with this theory that ji meant some kind of government building is that we don't really see the character ji or tera used in the government building sense in other instances from this time in the literature of the archipelago. And so it seems a bit of a stretch to suggest that this is what is going on here. Personally, I envision that they did stand up a temple, though the actual location and design, let alone the artifacts within, have been lost to time. Owake's import of Buddhist expertise wasn't it for Buddhism during Nunakura's reign, and things continued to trickle in. In 579, for example, Shilla envoys brought a Buddhist image, indicating that they too had taken an interest in this foreign religion, and they were using it as part of their diplomacy. This may have been a further reason to pressure Yamato to at least look into the religion and join the larger world of Buddhist countries, but it doesn't seem to have swayed the sovereign, at least not in any obvious way. 5 years after the gift from Shilla in 584, Sogono Iname's son and heir, Sogono Umako, decided to give this interesting new religion another go. The atmosphere by this point was a little bit different. Still not entirely hospitable, but there had clearly been more and more interest in Buddhism since its first arrival 50 years before. In addition to the growing acceptance of this foreign religion, however, there were some key political aspects as well that may point to why Sogono Umako decided to act. You see, Nunakura, at the start of his reign, had been married to a woman named Hirohime. She was the daughter of Okinaga no Mate no Miko. Now, the Okinaga family doesn't get quite as much press as others, but they seem to have been relatively powerful. And let's not forget there was a sovereign, Okinaga Tarashihime, aka Jingu Tenno. They had not only supplied Hirohime as a daughter to the current sovereign, but their name is found in the lists of people who had produced wives of the sovereign going back for at least several generations. Hirohime was the queen, and no doubt her progeny was expected to eventually come to the throne and rule as sovereign themselves. However, in 576, just 5 years into Nunakura's reign, Hirohime passed away. This tragic event nonetheless left a bit of a political void in the form of the queen, whose offspring would no doubt possess some serious political chops, whether or not they actually ruled. Fortunately for the Soga family, they already had an answer. Toyomike Kashikiya Hime, the daughter of Ame Kunioshi and Kitashi Hime, which made her half sister to Nunakura, but more than that, it made her the niece of none other than Soga no Umako himself, since her mother was also a child of Soga no Iname. And without spoiling too much, put a pin in her name. We will definitely be coming back to her in later episodes. It is unclear whether Kashikiya Hime was already one of Nunakura's consorts, or if she was instead promoted directly to queen, based on the way the chronicle talks about it anyway. But queen she did become. We are told that she was taken up at the urging of the court, probably by certain prominent figures therein, and so the Sogas planned to marry their daughters into the royal lineage and thus use blood ties to more closely bind themselves to the central authority, appears to have been working. This also meant that as Umako tried once again to get Buddhism off the ground, he now had a supposedly friendly figure in the royal bedchamber who could help whisper in the sovereign's ear from time to time. So he had, presumably, at least a little more clout than his father had when he had tried to set up a temple. Now, to start things off, Soga no Umako had heard about 2 Buddha images in the archipelago, and he went about acquiring them. The first was a stone image of Miroku, aka Maitreya, the future Buddha who was said to come in another 4,000 to 9,000 years to remind people of the Dharma once again. This had been brought from Baekje by an immigrant known to us as Kafka no Omi. The other was an image of the Buddha, presumably Gautama, the historical Buddha, and it was in the possession of one Saheki no Muraji. Well, having acquired these images, Soga no Umako went looking for someone with previous knowledge of Buddhist practices who could assist in this whole thing. To do this, he enlisted the help of Kurabe no Sukuri no Shiba Tato, along with a few others. Tato is traditionally thought to have come from the continent, possibly as early as 522 CE, about 63 years earlier. The Fuso Ryaki, compiled in the 11th century, claims he came from the Great Tang, even though that dynasty had yet to have been established. And they claim that he immigrated to the country of Yamato, where he built a grass hut and installed an image of the Buddha. While this is likely a bit of exaggeration on the part of the ancient chroniclers, something to make Tato seem like the perfect resource, it is likely that Tato did come from the continent, or was a descendant in the first or second generations, and that he had some knowledge about the religion. This then did make him perfect for Soga no Umako's purposes, who needed someone who knew what to look for in others and who might be able to assist him in once again setting up a temple of his own. Sure enough, Tato found someone, a former monk from Goguryeo named Ebin in Japanese, now living in Harima, who had gone back to being a layperson. This is not as unusual as it may seem, as there are many reasons that someone might leave the monkhood and even later return back to it. Whether or not he was currently an ordained and practicing monk, Ebin would have known the rites and known how to proceed. Here I would note, It does seem a bit odd that Umiko would have searched high and low throughout the immigrant community if the Temple of Owake was still there in Naniwa. I mean, why didn't he just ask someone from that temple to come and get things kickstarted for him? Fortunately, we don't know, though it is possible that the Temple of Owake was no longer a going concern and had already failed for some reason. And so the former monk Ebin was brought on board Umiko's little project, and there are some sources that suggest there was a nun as well, known as Home, but didn't notice her name in the Nihon Shoki. Ebin, and possibly Home, were first told to instruct none other than Tato's own daughter, Shima, or possibly Shimane, to become a Buddhist nun. This may have been at least in part because Tato's family clearly already had some familiarity with Buddhism, and there may have also been some linguistic advantages depending on the languages they knew and spoke, especially as much as what had come over was probably written in Sinic characters. Shima was given the Buddhist name of Zenshin, or more appropriately, Zenshin Ni. This was another common practice, at least in East Asia, where new initiates would take a Buddhist, or more appropriately, a Dharma name when they were ordained. We'll see this a lot, and you have no doubt encountered such names elsewhere. They're typically made up of two kanji or Sinitic characters and pronounced with the onyomi reading. The name is often given by a teacher and emphasizes some Buddhist virtue or teaching that's considered particularly apt. In this case, Zenshin would appear to mean something like auspicious belief. Two other women were also taken on as students, or possibly servants or just junior nuns, along with Zenshin. They were Toyome, daughter of Ayabito no Hoshi, who became Zenzo, which would seem to indicate something like meditative storehouse, and Ishihime, daughter of Nishigori no Tsubo, who became Eizen, or something like blessed fortune. This all assumes that the kanji are correct. With the three nuns, Sogono Umiko then built a Buddhist temple onto the east side of his home, where he enshrined the stone image of Miroku, or Maitreya, the future Buddha, and he had the three newly minted nuns worship there while Shiba Tato and Hida no Atai provided them support and sustenance. Although they were ordained and worshiping a Buddhist image, it's interesting that Umiko chose women to become nuns rather than finding men to become monks. There is some thought that for all of the Buddhist instruction, Umiko was still following a popular indigenous model of worship, where the three women were essentially acting in place of female shamans, a tradition that would appear to have been common on the archipelago all the way back to Queen Himiko, and hinted at in various places within the Chronicles, including the very stories of the kami themselves. One also questions just how much the women knew regarding Buddhist practice, despite having a teacher who was a former monk. There was only a short time to get all this set up, at least if the dates in the Chronicles are any way true to real life. There are some suggestions that the women themselves were also rather young, with one note claiming that Zenshin was only 12 years old when she was ordained, hardly an age where one expects her to be leading, let alone teaching about a foreign religion from another country. Furthermore, the terms used surrounding the nuns' worship also leads one to wonder. The word used is sai or matsuri, which is sometimes translated as something like mere faire or abstinence, but here likely refers to some kind of meal or feast. This was possibly a Buddhist vegetarian feast, though the idea of a feast as worship seems to dovetail rather nicely once again into the local practices surrounding kami worship. From this first meal, Tato supposedly found a relic, by which would seem to be meant a relic of the Buddha. Now, what a relic of the Buddha was doing in the Japanese islands so far from the Indian subcontinent might seem to be a pertinent question, but that's where you would be completely wrong. You see, according to some traditions, the body of the Buddha had transformed through miraculous processes into hard crystal or glass stones, which themselves made their way across the world. This was fortunate for Buddhists, who therefore didn't need to send away for fresh relics from India every time they wanted to found a new temple. They just had to find appropriate relics where they were. Now, to test the relics, we aren't given much more of a description of what they actually were. Sogano Umiko took a giant iron maul and brought the hammer down on the relic Tato had found. However, rather than the relic shattering, as one might expect, the iron maul itself broke, along with the block of iron that they had put underneath of it. After testing its strength, the relic was then placed in water, where it would float or sink depending on what was desired. This supposedly proved that the relic was holy, and so it was used to inaugurate a new pagoda. The pagoda was built on the top of the hill of Ono, or large field, and we are told that they had the nuns conduct another ritual feast prior to placing the relic on top of the pagoda, recalling the purpose of the pagoda as the replacement for the stupa, the repository for relics of the Buddha at a temple complex. In the background of all of this, while they were putting this temple together, Yamato was apparently experiencing another epidemic. We're told that pestilence was in the land, and Sogano Umiko himself became quite ill. Trying to ascertain the cause of his own illness, Umiko enlisted a diviner who told him that the pestilence was a curse sent by the Buddha worshipped by Sogano Umiko's father, Sogano Iname. Once again, we see the Buddha being treated more like a kami. After all, why would someone who came to save all sentient beings curse someone? And yet they did seem to believe that this curse was due to the way that the previous temple that Iname had set up had been torn down and the image tossed unceremoniously into the Yodo River. And since the cause of the pestilence had been determined by a diviner, apparently that was enough to get Nunakura on board. Whether or not he personally worshipped the Buddha, he allowed Umiko to worship the image so that he could appease his father's gods and hopefully recover. Shortly thereafter, however, less than a week later if the dates are to be believed, we start to really get a sense of deja vu, as Mononobe no Yuge no Moriya, son of Mononobe no Okoshi and the current Omuraji of the Mononobe family, remonstrated Nunakura over this whole Buddhism thing. Just as Okoshi had done decades previously, Moriya claimed that the whole reason there was an epidemic in the first place was clearly because they had once again welcomed Buddhism into the land, and they needed to put a stop to it. Nunakura was swayed by his arguments, and he took back what he had said and issued an edict that demanded the worship of Buddhism cease immediately. Here we see, once again, the destruction of the Buddhist temple, but this time around we're given much greater detail. For one thing, Moriya seems to have taken rather a lot of pride in this. He went to the temple with his men, sat down in a chair, and from there he oversaw the destruction of the pagoda, the temple, and even the stone image. Whatever couldn't be destroyed was taken to the Naniwa Canal and thrown into the waters. As he did all of this, the chroniclers record that there was wind and rain, but no clouds. Not unlike the idea of a fox's wedding, an interesting phenomenon where you can have the sun, usually in the morning or late afternoon, shining at the same time that rain clouds overhead are opening up and the heavens are pouring down. Moriya simply donned a raincoat, and then he upbraided Sogano Umiko and all of his followers, trying to shame them. He then had Sogano Umiko call forward the various nuns, who were stripped of their 3 garments. This is a term for the traditional Buddhist robes, although in East Asia this was eventually replaced with the single kesa over several lower garments to help fend off the cold. Here it is unclear if just a kesa is meant, or if they were dressed in an attempt at clothing from the Indian subcontinent. The nuns were then imprisoned and flogged at the roadside station of Tsubaki no Ichi, otherwise known as Tsubaki Market. Despite thus cleansing the land of Buddhist influence for the second time, the pestilence didn't stop, and people continued to grow ill and die. In fact, there was an embassy planned to go over to the continent to talk about the Nimna situation once again, but both the sovereign Nunakura as well as Mononobe no Moriya himself became ill and were afflicted with sores. Once again, the land was plagued and people were dying. According to the chroniclers, who were, of course, writing after the fact in a well established Buddhist state, the people started to privately complain that clearly Buddhism hadn't been the problem. In fact, perhaps Soga no Umeko's diviner had been correct all along, and the plague was actually because they hadn't accepted Buddhism, rather than a punishment for neglecting the local kami. A few months later, Soga no Umeko sent another message to the sovereign. Umeko was still ill and hadn't recovered, even with Moriya purging the influences of Buddhism. Umeko claimed that the only things that would cure him were the three precious things, which is to say, the Sanzo, or the three treasures of Buddhism: the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Based on the severity of the disease, Nunakura authorized him to worship privately, and the nuns were allowed to assist him. He rebuilt the temple and he provided for the nuns himself. Eventually, Umeko recovered, but unfortunately, the sovereign did not. Nunakura Futodamashiki, aka Bidatsu Tennou, died in 585, laid low by the plague that had swept through the land. At the funeral, the politics were on full display. Soga no Umeko had no love lost for Mononobe no Moriya, nor vice versa. As Umeko was delivering a speech at the funeral, Moriya made a comment that with Umeko's extremely long sword at his side, he looked like a fat little sparrow that had been pierced through by a hunting shaft. Meanwhile, Umeko noted that Moriya, when he got up, was shaking as he gave his speech. Whether from emotion, nerves, or something else, we don't know. And so Umeko suggested hanging bells on him so that they would jingle as he shook. From this particular trading of barbs, the feud between the Mononobe and the Soga, it would only grow. There is, it seems, another account of all of this, buried amongst everything else, that claims that Mononobe no Moriya, Omiwa no Sakai no Kimi, and Nakatomi no Iware no Muraji all conspired together to destroy the Buddhist religion. They wanted to burn the temple and pagoda that Soga no Umeko had built, but Umeko opposed the project and would not allow it. Or so we are told. Here it's unclear if we're talking about the previous temple or the rebuilt one, but the names here are interesting. Of course, we know that the Soga and the Mononobe were going at it, and the inclusion of Nakatomi no Iware simply picks up the previous alliance between the Mononobe and Nakatomi, both of whom had been active during the assault on Soga no Iname's temple. Lastly, though, there is Omiwa no Sakai no Kimi, which I find particularly interesting. This figure would appear to be from the Omiwa family and region, likely drawing some amount of respect from their connection with Mount Miwa itself and the ancient worship that went on there. So in this version, there really is a triple threat of the old guard banding together to resist this newfangled foreign faith. Incidentally, this same figure, Omiwa no Sakai no Kimi, also appears just after the death of Nunakura, when Prince Ohoye figured he could just waltz in and take the throne, on the assumption that he was owed it by birth. He was a half-brother to Nunakura, another son of Ame Kunioshi, and his mother, Onanegime, was another daughter of Soga no Iname. Ohoye was therefore nephew to Umeko, and perhaps that's one of the reasons he thought he could just waltz in and take a seat at the head of government. But Prince Ohoye was foiled by none other than Omiwa no Sakai, who posted a guard around the palace and made sure that nobody defiled it until a new sovereign had been identified by the court. Ohoye voiced his complaint that Omiwa was protecting the court of a dead king, and that they should instead come to the court of a living king, presumably meaning his own. But that story will take us past this point, and there are still some other details of Nunakura or Bidatsu's reign I want to touch on, such as his dealings on the continent. But here we can see how Buddhism and the feud between the Soga and the Mononobe was in full swing, and that will definitely play a large part in future episodes. In addition, we'll see how this time Umeko wouldn't take things lying down. He was going to get this Buddhism thing to stick one way or the other, and we'll see what happens when he finally founds the first permanent temple in Japan. A temple that, well, perhaps not as grand as it once was, continues to operate into the modern day. So, till then, Just want to thank you once again for listening and for all of your support. If you like what we're doing, please tell your friends and feel free to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you feel the need to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we do have information about how you can donate on Patreon or through our coffee site, ko-fi.com/Sengoku Daimyo. Or find links over at our main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast, where we'll have more discussion on topics from this episode. Also, feel free to tweet at us at Sengoku Podcast or reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page. You can also email us at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. And that's all for now. Thank you once again, and I'll see you next episode on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.